that he shares, which match well with what Paul said in Ephesians, are still important and still true. This first epistle also shares important words regarding the role of the shepherd in the church. In chapter 5, the first few verses, Peter actually uses 3 words for this office. He uses the word elder, the word pastor or shepherd, and the word overseer, the one who watches over, the overseer. Those same 3 words were used by Paul when he spoke to the elders of the church at Ephesus. When he met with them in Acts 20, he used those same 3 words interchangeably. So the elder is the pastor, is the overseer, and that office is important. And we understand that there are 3 different Greek words that are used there. But one of them does speak of somebody who has some years of experience. That one that's translated elder. So if you don't have a 25-year-old elder over the church, you always have elders, plural, but it has to be somebody with some experience who's proven themselves in the faith. And our church is lucky enough to have some, blessed enough, lucky is not a good word, blessed enough to have some good elders that are the shepherds of our congregation and the overseers. And Peter's words are important. Last thing I'll say about 1 Peter, the content of this letter shows that there was unity in the teaching of Peter and Paul. Some preachers make a big deal out of the fact that Paul one time called Peter out. Remember that? Peter had kind of gone back a little bit too much into the law and the way it was before the church began, and Paul called him out. Peter accepted that. But the fact is they had great respect for each other, and this book, as I said, there are some people who even think that Paul wrote it, and that's because the language sounds so much like Paul at times, particularly certain sections. And so I think it's important for us to see there wasn't a rivalry between Peter and Paul. They both served in different capacities and were used by God as apostles to do great things. So I never put much stock into this fact that they had this, real rivalry against each other.
Dave, one
Yes.
thing, since you've touched on it, in 5:12, Peter says to help Silas in writing the book. Paul and Silas were together, and Silas would obviously think in Pauline ways because they were spent much time together.
Yes.
So if Silas was, as he is indicating, I've always looked at it's like Peter wrote it, but he's the amanuensis or the writer, and probably also the influencer of some of the ideas.
Right.
In this. And that's why
You threw out a big word there.
amanuensis was just one right.
That's a scribe, yeah. I know what it is, but I thought, man, that is a word, David. That's impressive.
But it,
But yes, Silas is mentioned in chapter 5, verse 12. I'm really glad you mentioned that, David. And by the way, that's just one more reason that a few people say, oh, that proves that Paul wrote it, because Paul and Silas traveled together and did, Paul, on 2 of his missionary journeys, Silas was with him, right? But actually, I think David's right. If Silas is the one that's actually the scribe, he's writing it in a style that would have been similar to when he worked with Paul. So, great call there.
Counts for the Greek, the reason why
Yeah.
the Greek probably was
The
so
Greek,
much
yeah.
smoother.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point. You guys are killing me. I haven't had mine yet. It's all good. Oh, I love to give Doc a hard time, but then again, he was my first Sunday school teacher. Well, I guess I had a teacher in the nursery until I was 2 years old. I don't remember. You're the first one I remember. When I was 3 and 4, Doc was my Sunday school teacher.
Ring the bell.
We had 3 kids in there, didn't we? But we were there every week. They're on the Mashoko Christian Mission Station. And Daryl was our teacher. Man, that was a great class. Barry and Carolyn and me.
Thumbs up and subscribe. Ding.
All right, 2 Peter. Let's talk a little bit about this second letter. First thing I'd say by way of background is the style and content of this book is very different from 1 Peter. Now that doesn't necessarily shock us because same author, but writing as best we can tell to the same people. We'll talk about that in a minute. So why would he duplicate himself? But it is very different. No suffering, number 2, no suffering is mentioned here, but rather vigilance. Vigilance, that idea of always being ready. And the reason is because in 2 Peter he talks a lot about false teachers. And he wants them to be vigilant in the sense of follow what you've been taught by the apostles. Don't go for what the false teachers are shedding. And also be prepared for the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, by the way, is something that we know is coming. The Bible talks about it. And it's the day when Jesus returns. And so we're to always be prepared because we're either going to see the return of the Lord or we're going to die and face the throne of judgment. But we're to be vigilant because we don't know when that's going to happen. So, no suffering, rather vigilance. There is a real parallel, by the way, between 2 Peter and 2 Timothy. Remember 2 Timothy we looked at a few weeks ago was Paul's final charge to his son in the faith, Timothy. And what's interesting is Peter is now writing just before he's going to be executed, the last thing that we have from Peter. 2 Timothy was the last thing Paul wrote before he faced the execution. And so both of them were thinking about some of the same issues, but I think also wanting to present a final challenge, a final charge to God's people because they knew that their life on earth was about over. Their time of preaching and of writing is going to be over. And so there is some real tie-in between 2 Peter and 2 Timothy in theme. Well, the author obviously is the same, right? We looked earlier and said in 1 Peter chapter 1, he identified himself just Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. But how about this time? Slightly different. Look at that first phrase. Doc, give it to us this time. The first phrase.
Simon.
Oh, you got food now. I'm sorry. Picked a bad time.
Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so he now throws out his given name, Simon, as well as Peter, that name that Jesus gave him, and he adds a servant to apostle. No big deal, right? I mean, he can introduce himself however he wants, but I think it is interesting that in this final thing he's going to write, he not only says, I'm an apostle, which brings authority, one of those that was with Jesus that was given a special authority over the church, but I'm a servant, a fellow servant as well. Interestingly, 2 Peter is the most disputed New Testament book other than Hebrews as to authorship. We talked a lot about Hebrews, you remember. The one book in the New Testament that doesn't give us an author. All these other books do. Peter here introduces himself. So I'm always kind of shocked that people, again, want to throw out different names. But I'll tell you why this one is even more disputed than 1 Peter. It's because 2 Peter and Jude, that we'll look at in a couple of weeks, are in many ways, parts of them, carbon copies of each other. So I want to show you with a couple of examples, and I need your help to do that. I need somebody who will look up 2 Peter 2, verses 4, and then in a minute, verse 6. So 2 Peter 2, 4, and 6. Got a taker who will do that in a minute? Okay, Josh, can we get that one? And then the other one is in the book of Jude, which doesn't have chapters because it's just one, right? And so Jude verse 6 and Jude verse 7. Got a taker on that will go to the book of Jude, the next to last book in the Bible before Revelation. And get verse 6 and 7. We'll give you a second. But I want to show you how they line up And these are just a couple of examples. So 2 Peter 2:4, Josh, I think he's got that one.
Yes. For God did not spare even the angels who sinned. He threw them into hell, in gloomy pits of darkness, where they are being held until the day of judgment.
Yeah, and that's a crazy passage. But basically, we know that there were fallen angels, including Lucifer, who became the devil or Satan. And Revelation talks about him sweeping a third of the stars out of the sky, which we take means that he took that many angels of light with him that became angels of darkness. This is now what is being referred to by Peter. Now, Jude, verse 6, who's got that? Okay, John?
And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day.
Yeah, same thing, right? Different wording, but the exact same message. Now, let's look at the next one, 2 Peter 2:6. Josh will get that one for us.
Later, God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and turned them into heaps of ashes. He made them an example of what will happen to ungodly people.
Yeah, passage that is tough. I mean, we don't like to read about Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's important to understand that though we serve a God of love, because he is a God of love and holiness, he's a God of judgment. And by the way, hell originally prepared for the devil and his angels, as Revelation tells us. But now listen to Jude verse 7.
In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They served as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire.
So, once again, Sodom and Gomorrah, same basic message. Basically, the whole second chapter of 2 Peter. So 2 Peter 2 matches up almost perfectly with Jude verses 3 through 19. So a big part of Jude. So there then becomes this argument, one had to have plagiarized the other. And I personally don't buy that. I believe the Bible was inspired by the Holy Spirit. You know what I think. If you've heard me preach and teach enough. I believe that the same Holy Spirit inspired Peter and Jude to write a similar message. What's interesting is, I believe that Peter actually wrote before Jude did, and we'll talk about that when we get to Jude. But there are a lot of people who cast aspersion on Peter who say Jude was written first and now Peter's copying him, or whoever wrote this book. And so there are people that say this book wasn't the product of the Apostle Peter. He wouldn't have plagiarized Jude. And again,